Bethlehem hath sprung. Of Jesse's lineage coming, as those of old hath sung.
Welcome to the 8th day of CraftLit. For today's CraftLit Christmas compilation, please enjoy A Conscience Pudding, 1904. Lo, how a rose ere blooming. Bertie's Ride, A Recruit at Christmas from 1892, Christmas Every Day, Christmas and the Spirit of Democracy, and Why the Chimes Rang. If you haven't listened to the day one, the first day of CraftLit, you may want to go do that. All of the information on how and where to find other episodes will be in that opening. However, the short version is, if you're watching/listening on YouTube, you can get the playlist on our YouTube channel. And if you are looking at show notes and listening to this as an actual audio podcast, if you look in the show notes, you will see not only links to all the previous episodes, but time codes telling you where to fast wind to or rewind to be able to listen to exactly the right story that you want to listen to. Here we go.
The Conscience Pudding by E. Nesbit. Read by Corrie Samuel. The Conscience Pudding from The New Treasure Seekers by E. Nesbit. It was Christmas, nearly a year after Mother died. I cannot write about Mother, but I will just say one thing. If she had only been away for a little while, and not for always, we shouldn't have been so keen on having a Christmas. I didn't understand this then, but I am much older now, and I think it was just because everything was so different and horrid we felt we must do something, and perhaps we were not particular enough what. Things make you much more unhappy when you loaf about than when you are doing events. Father had to go away just about Christmas. He had heard that his wicked partner, who ran away with his money, was in France, and he thought he could catch him, but really he was in Spain, where catching criminals is never practised. We did not know this till afterwards. Before Father went away, he took Dora and Oswald into his study and said, "I'm awfully sorry I've got to go away, but it is very serious business and I must go. You'll be good while I'm away, kiddies, won't you?" We promised faithfully. Then he said, "There are reasons. You wouldn't understand if I tried to tell you, but you can't have much for Christmas this year. But I've told Matilda to make you a good plain pudding. Perhaps next Christmas will be brighter." It was, for the next Christmas saw us the affluent nephews and nieces of an Indian uncle, but that is quite another story, as good old Kipling says. When Father had been seen off at Lewisham Station with his bags and a plaid rug in a strap, we came home again, and it was horrid. There were papers and things littered all over his room where he had packed. We tidied the room up. It was the only thing we could do for him. It was Dickie who accidentally broke his shaving glass, and H.O. made a paper boat out of a letter we found out afterwards Father particularly wanted to keep. This took us some time, and when we went into the nursery, the fire was black out, and we could not get it alight again, even with the whole Daily Chronicle. Matilda, who was our general then, was out, as well as the fire, so we went and sat in the kitchen. There is always a good fire in kitchens. The kitchen hearthrug was not nice to sit on, so we spread newspapers on it. It was sitting in the kitchen, I think, that brought to our minds my father's parting words, about the pudding, I mean. Oswald said, "Father said we couldn't have much for Christmas for secret reasons, and he said he had told Matilda to make us a plain pudding." The plain pudding instantly cast its shadow over the deepening gloom of our young minds. "I wonder how plain she'll make it," Dickie said. As plain you may depend," said Oswald. "Here am I, where are you, pudding. That's her sort." The others groaned, and we gathered closer round the fire till the newspapers rustled madly. "I believe I could make a pudding that wasn't plain, if I tried," Alice said. "Why shouldn't we?" "No chink," said Oswald, with brief sadness. "How much would it cost?" Noel asked, and added that Dora had 2p and H.O. had a French halfpenny. Dora got the cookery book out of the dresser drawer, where it lay doubled up among clothes pegs, dirty dusters, scallop shells, string, penny novelettes, and the dining room corkscrew. The general we had then, it seemed as if she did all the cooking on the cookery book instead of on the baking board. There were traces of so many bygone meals upon its pages. "It doesn't say Christmas pudding at all," said Dora. "Try plum," the resourceful Oswald instantly counselled. Dora turned the greasy pages anxiously. Plum pudding, 518. A rich, with flour, 517. Christmas, 517. Cold brandy sauce for, 241. We shouldn't care about that, so it's no use looking. Good without eggs, 518. Plain, 518. We don't want that, anyhow. Christmas, 517, that's the one. It took her a long time to find the page. Oswald got a shovel of coals and made up the fire. It blazed up like the devouring elephant the Daily Telegraph always calls it. Then Dora read, "Christmas plum pudding, time 6 hours. "To eat it in?" said H.O. "No, silly, to make it. Forge ahead, Dora," Dicky replied. Dora went on. 2072. 1 pound and a half of raisins, half a pound of currants, 3/4 of a pound of breadcrumbs, half a pound of flour, 3/4 of a pound of beef suet, 9 eggs, 1 wineglassful of brandy, half a pound of citron and orange peel, half a nutmeg, and a little ground ginger. I wonder how little ground ginger. "A teacupful would be enough, I think," Alice said. "We must not be extravagant." "We haven't got anything yet to be extravagant with," said Oswald, who had toothache that day. "What would you do with the things if you got them?" "You'd chop the suet as fine as possible. I wonder how fine that is," replied Dora and the book together. "And mix it with the breadcrumbs and flour, add the currants washed and dried." "Not starched, then," said Alice. "The citron and orange peel cut into thin slices. I wonder what they call thin. Matilda's thin bread and butter is quite different from what I mean by it. And the raisins, stoned and divided. How many heaps would you divide them into?" "7, I suppose," said Alice. "1 for each person and 1 for the pot. I mean pudding. Mix it all well together with the grated nutmeg and ginger. Then stir in 9 eggs well beaten, and the brandy. We'll leave that out, I think. And again mix it thoroughly together, that every ingredient may be moistened. Put it into a buttered mould, tie over tightly, and boil for 6 hours. Serve it ornamented with holly and brandy poured over it." "I should think holly and brandy poured over it would be simply beastly," said Dicky. "I expect the book knows. I dare say holly and water would do as well, though. This pudding may be made a month before. It's no use reading about that, though, because we've only got 4 days to Christmas." "It's no use reading about any of it," said Oswald, with thoughtful repeatedness, "because we haven't got the things, and we haven't got the coin to get them." "We might get the tins somehow," said Dicky. "There must be lots of kind people who would subscribe to a Christmas pudding for poor children who hadn't any," Noel said. "Well, I'm going skating at Penn's," said Oswald. "It's no use thinking about puddings. We must put up with it plain." So he went, and Dicky went with him. When they returned to their home in the evening, the fire had been lighted again in the nursery, and the others were just having tea. We toasted our bread and butter on the bare side, and it gets a little warm among the butter. This is called a French toast. "I like English better, but it is more expensive," Alice said. "Matilda is in a frightful rage about your putting those coals on a kitchen fire, Oswald. She says we shan't have enough to last over Christmas as it is. And father gave her a talking to before he went about them. Asked her if she ate them, she says, but I don't believe he did. Anyway, she's locked the coal cellar door, and she's got the key in her pocket. I don't see how we can boil the pudding." "What pudding?" said Oswald dreamily. He was thinking of a chap he had seen at Penn's, who had cut the date 1899 on the ice with 4 strokes. "The pudding," Alice said. "Oh, we've had such a time, Oswald. First Dora and I went to the shops to find out exactly what the pudding would cost. It's only 2 and 11 halfpenny, counting in the holly." "It's no good," Oswald repeated. "He is very patient and will say the same thing any number of times. It's no good. You know we've got no tin." "Ah," said Alice, "but H.O. and I went out, and we called at some of the houses in Granville Park and Dartmouth Hill, and we got a lot of sixpences and shillings, besides pennies, and one old gentleman gave us half-a-crown. He was so nice. Quite bald, with a knitted red and blue waistcoat. We've got 8 and 7pence. Oswald did not feel quite sure Father would like us to go asking for shillings and sixpences, or even half-crowns from strangers, but he did not say so. The money had been asked for and got, and it couldn't be helped, and perhaps he wanted the pudding. I'm not able to remember exactly why he did not speak up and say, "This is wrong," but anyway he didn't. Alice and Dora went out and bought the things next morning. They bought double quantities, so that it came to 5 shillings and 11pence, and was enough to make a noble pudding. There was a lot of holly left over for decorations. We used very little for the sauce. The money that was left we spent very anxiously in other things to eat, such as dates and figs and toffee. We did not tell Matilda about it. She was a red-haired girl, and apt to turn shirty at the least thing. Concealed under our jackets and overcoats, we carried the parcels up to the nursery, and hid them in the treasure chest we had there. It was the bureau drawer. It was locked up afterwards, because the treacle got all over the green baize and the little drawers inside it, while we were waiting to begin to make the pudding. It was the grocer told us we ought to put treacle in the pudding, and also about not so much ginger as a teacupful. When Matilda had begun to pretend to scrub the floor, she pretended this 3 times a week, so as to have an excuse not to let us in the kitchen, but I know she used to read novelettes most of the time, because Alice and I had a squint through the window more than once. We barricaded the nursery door and set to work. We were very careful to be quite clean. We washed our hands as well as the currants. I have sometimes thought we did not get all the soap off the currants. The pudding smelt like a washing day when the time came to cut it open. And we washed a corner of the table to chop the suet on. Chopping suet looks easy till you try. Father's machine he weighs letters with did to weigh out the things. We did this very carefully, in case the grocer had not done so. Everything was right except the raisins. H.O. had carried them home. He was very young then, and there was a hole in the corner of the paper bag, and his mouth was sticky. Lots of people have been hanged to a gibbet in chains on evidence no worse than that, and we told H.O. so till he cried. This was good for him. It was not unkindness to H.O., but part of our duty. Chopping suet as fine as possible is much harder than anyone would think, as I said before. So is crumbling bread, especially if your loaf is new like ours was. When we had done them, the breadcrumbs and the suet were both very large and lumpy, and of a dingy grey colour, something like pale slate pencil. They looked a better colour when we had mixed them with the flour. The girls had washed the currants with brown Windsor soap and the sponge. Some of the currants got inside the sponge, and kept coming out in a bath for days afterwards. I see now that this was not quite nice. We cut the candied peel as thin as we wish people would cut our bread and butter. We tried to take the stones out of the raisins, but they were too sticky, so we just divided them up in 7 lots. Then we mixed the other things in the wash-hand basin from the spare bedroom that was always spare. We each put in our own lot of raisins, and turned it all into a pudding basin, and tied it up in one of Alice's pinafores, which was the nearest thing to a proper pudding cloth we could find, at any rate clean. What was left sticking to the wash-hand basin did not taste so bad. "It's a little bit soapy," Alice said, "but perhaps that will boil out, like stains in tablecloths." It was a difficult question how to boil the pudding. Matilda proved furious when asked to let us, just because someone had happened to knock her hat off the scullery door, and Pincher had got it and done for it. However, part of the embassy nicked a saucepan, while the others were being told what Matilda thought about the hat, and we got hot water out of the bathroom and made it boil over our nursery fire. We put the pudding in it. It was now getting on towards the hour of tea, and let it boil. With some exceptions, owing to the fire going down and Matilda not hurrying up with coals, it boiled for an hour and a quarter. Then Matilda came suddenly in and said, I'm not going to have you messing about in here with my saucepans," and she tried to take it off the fire. You will see that we couldn't stand this. It was not likely. I do not remember who it was that told her to mind her own business, and I think I have forgotten who caught hold of her first to make her chuck it. I'm sure no needless violence was used. Anyway, while the struggle progressed, Alice and Dora took the saucepan away and put it in the boot cupboard under the stairs and put the key in their pocket. This sharp encounter made everyone very hot and cross. We got over it before Matilda did, but we brought her round before bedtime. Quarrels should always be made up before bedtime. It says so in the Bible. If this simple rule was followed, there would not be so many wars and martyrs and lawsuits and inquisitions and bloody deaths at the stake. All the house was still. The gas was out all over the house, except on the first landing, when several darkly shrouded figures might have been observed creeping downstairs to the kitchen. On the way, with superior precaution, we got out our saucepan. The kitchen fire was red, but low. The coal cellar was locked, and there was nothing in the scuttle but a little coal dust, and the piece of brown paper that is put in to keep the coals from tumbling out through the bottom where the hole is. We put the saucepan on the fire and plied it with fuel. 2 Chronicles, a Telegraph, and 2 Family Herald novelettes were burned in vain. I am almost sure the pudding did not boil at all that night. "Never mind," Alice said. "We can each nick a piece of coal every time we go into the kitchen tomorrow." This daring scheme was faithfully performed, and by night we had nearly half a waste paper basket of coal, coke, and cinders. And in the depth of night once more we might have been observed, this time with our collier-like waste paper basket in our guarded hands. There was more fire left in the grate that night, and we fed it with the fuel we had collected. This time the fire blazed up, and the pudding boiled like mad. This was the time it boiled 2 hours. At least I think it was about that, but we dropped asleep on the kitchen tables and dresser. You dare not be lowly in the night in a kitchen because of the beetles. We were aroused by a horrible smell. It was the pudding cloth burning. All the water had secretly boiled itself away. We filled it up at once with cold, and the saucepan cracked. So we cleaned it and put it back on the shelf and took another and went to bed. You see what a lot of trouble we had over the pudding. Every evening till Christmas, which had now become only the day after tomorrow, we sneaked down in the inky midnight and boiled that pudding for as long as it would. On Christmas morning we chopped the holly for the sauce, but we put hot water instead of brandy and moist sugar. Some of them said it was not so bad. Oswald was not one of these. Then came the moment when the plain pudding Father had ordered smoked upon the board. Matilda brought it in and went away at once. She had a cousin out of Woolwich Arsenal to see her that day, I remember. Those far-off days are quite distinct in memory's recollection still. Then we got out our own pudding from its hiding-place and gave it one last hurried boil, only 7 minutes, because of the general impatience which Oswald and Dora could not cope with. We had found means to secrete a dish, and we now tried to dish the pudding up, but it stuck to the basin and had to be dislodged with a chisel. The pudding was horribly pale. We poured the holly sauce over it, and Dora took up the knife and was just cutting it, when a few simple words from H.O. turned us from happy and triumphing cookery artists to persons in despair. He said, "How pleased all those kind ladies and gentlemen would be if they knew we were the poor children they gave the shillings and sixpences and things for." We all said, "What?" It was no moment for politeness. "I say," H.O. said, "they'd be glad if they knew it was us was enjoying the pudding, and not dirty little really poor children." "You should say you were, not you was," said Dora, but it was as in a dream and only from habit. "Do you mean to say," Oswald spoke firmly, yet not angrily, "that you and Alice went and begged for money for poor children, and then kept it?" "We didn't keep it," said H.O. "We spent it." "We've kept the things, you little duffer," said Dicky, looking at the pudding sitting alone and uncared for on its dish. "You begged for money for poor children, and then kept it. It's stealing, that's what it is. I don't say so much about you. You're only a silly kid, But Alice knew better. Why did you do it?" He turned to Alice, but she was now too deep in tears to get a word out. H.O. looked a bit frightened, but he answered the question. We have taught him this. He said, "I thought they'd give us more if I said poor children than if I said just us." "That's cheating," said Dicky. "Downright beastly mean low cheating." "I'm not," said H.O., "and you're another." Then he began to cry too. I do not know how the others felt, but I understand from Oswald that he felt that now the honour of the House of Bastable had been stamped on in the dust, and it didn't matter what happened. He looked at the beastly holly that had been left over from the sauce and was stuck up over the pictures. It now appeared hollow and disgusting, though it had got quite a lot of berries, and some of it was the varied kind, green and white. The figs and dates and toffee were set out in the doll's dinner service. The very sight of it all made Oswald blush sickly. He owns he would have liked to cuff H.O., and, if he did for a moment wish to shake Alice, the author for one can make allowances. Now Alice choked and spluttered and wiped her eyes fiercely and said, "It's no use ragging H.O., it's my fault. I'm older than he is." H.O. said, "It couldn't be Alice's fault. I don't see as it was wrong." "That, not as," murmured Dora, putting her arm round the sinner who had brought this degrading blight upon our family tree. But such is girls' undetermined and affectionate silliness. "Tell sister all about it, H.O. dear. Why couldn't it be Alice's fault?" H.O. cuddled up to Dora and said snufflingly in his nose, "Because she hadn't got nothing to do with it. I collected it all. She never went into one of the houses. She didn't want to." "And then took all the credit of getting the money," said Dicky savagely. Oswald said, "Not much credit," in scornful tones. "Oh, you are beastly, the whole lot of you, except Dora," Alice said, stamping her foot in rage and despair. "I tore my frock on a nail going out, and I didn't want to go back, and I got H.O. to go to the houses alone, and I waited for him outside. And I asked him not to say anything because I didn't want Dora to know about the frock. It's my best. And I don't know what he said inside. He never told me. But I'll bet anything he didn't mean to cheat." "You said lots of kind people would be ready to give money to get pudding for poor children, so I asked them to." Oswald, with his strong right hand, waved a wave of passing things over. "We'll talk about that another time," he said. "Just now we've got weightier things to deal with." He pointed to the pudding, which had grown cold during the conversation to which I have alluded. H.O. stopped crying, but Alice went on with it. Oswald now said, "We're a base and outcast family. Until that pudding's out of the house, we shan't be able to look anyone in the face. We must see that that pudding goes to poor children, not grizzling, grumpy, whiny-piny, pretending poor children, but real poor ones, just as poor as they can stick." "And the figs too, and the dates," said Noel, with regretting tones. "Every fig," said Dicky sternly. "Oswald is quite right." This honourable resolution made us feel a bit better. We hastily put on our best things and washed ourselves a bit, and hurried out to find some really poor people to give the pudding to. We cut it in slices ready and put it in a basket with the figs and dates and toffee. We would not let H.O. come with us at first because he wanted to, and Alice would not come because of him, so at last we had to let him. The excitement of tearing into your best things heals the hurt that wounded honour feels, as the poetry writer said, or at any rate it makes the hurt feel better. We went out into the streets. They were pretty quiet. Nearly everybody was eating its Christmas dessert. But presently we met a woman in an apron. Oswald said very politely, "Please, are you a poor person?" And she told us to get along with us. The next we met was a shabby man with a hole in his left boot. Again Oswald said, "Please, are you a poor person, and have you any poor little children?" The man told us not to come any of our games with him, or we should laugh on the wrong side of our faces. We went on sadly. We had no heart to stop and explain to him that we had no games to come. The next was a young man near the obelisk. Dora tried this time. She said, "Oh, if you please, we've got some Christmas pudding in this basket, and if you're a poor person you can have some." "Poor as Job," said the young man in a hoarse voice, and he had to come up out of a red comforter to say it. We gave him a slice of the pudding, and he bit into it without thanks or delay. The next minute he had thrown the pudding slap in Dora's face and was clutching Dicky by the collar. "Blimey if I don't chuck you in the river, the whole blooming lot of you," he exclaimed. The girls screamed, the boys shouted, and though Oswald threw himself on the insulter of his sister with all his manly vigour, yet but for a friend of Oswald's, who was in the police, passing at that instant, the author shudders to think what might have happened, for he was a strong young man, and Oswald is not yet come to his full strength, and the Quaggy runs all too near. Our policeman led our assailant aside, and we waited anxiously as he told us to. After long uncertain moments, the young man in the comforter loafed off grumbling, and our policeman turned to us. "Said you give him a dollop of pudding, and it tasted of soap and hair oil." I suppose the hair oil must have been the brown winsoriness of the soap coming out. We were sorry, but it was still our duty to get rid of the pudding. The Quaggy was handy, it is true, but when you have collected money to feed poor children and spent it on pudding, it is not right to throw that pudding in the river. People do not subscribe shillings and sixpences and half-crowns to feed a hungry flood with Christmas pudding. Yet we shrank from asking any more people whether they were poor persons, or about their families, and still more from offering the pudding to chance people who might bite into it and taste the soap before we had time to get away. It was Alice, the most paralysed with disgrace of all of us, who thought of the best idea. She said, "Let's take it to the workhouse. At any rate they're all poor there, and they mayn't go out without leave, so they can't run after us to do anything to us after the pudding. No one would give them leave to go out to pursue people who have brought them pudding and wreak vengeance on them, and at any rate we shall get rid of the conscience pudding. It's a sort of conscience money, you know, only it isn't money but pudding." The workhouse is a good way, but we stuck to it, though very cold, and hungrier than we thought possible when we started, for we had been so agitated we had not even stayed to eat the plain pudding our good father had so kindly and thoughtfully ordered for our Christmas dinner. The big bell at the workhouse made a man open the door to us when we rang it. Oswald said, and he spoke because he is next eldest to Dora, and she had had jolly well enough of saying anything about pudding. He said, "Please, we've brought some pudding for the poor people." He looked us up and down, and he looked at our basket. Then he said, "You'd better see the matron." We waited in a hall, feeling more and more uncomfy and less like Christmas. We were very cold indeed, especially our hands and our noses, and we felt less and less able to face the matron if she was horrid, and one of us at least wished we had chosen the Quaggy for the pudding's long home, and made it up to the robbed poor in some other way afterwards. Just as Alice was saying earnestly, in the burning cold ear of Oswald, "Let's put down the basket and make a bolt for it. Oh, Oswald, let's!" A lady came along the passage. She was very upright, and she had eyes that went through you like blue gimlets. I should not like to be obliged to thwart that lady if she had any design and mine was opposite. I'm glad this is not likely to occur. She said, "What's all this about a pudding?" H.O. said at once, before we could stop him, "They say I've stolen the pudding, so we've brought it here for the poor people." "No, we didn't. That wasn't why. The money was given. It was meant for the poor. Shut up, H.O., said the rest of us all at once. Then there was an awful silence. The lady gimleted us again one by one with her blue eyes. Then she said, "Come into my room. You all look frozen." She took us into a very jolly room with velvet curtains and a big fire, and the gas lighted, because now it was almost dark, even out of doors. She gave us chairs, and Oswald felt as if his was a dock, he felt so criminal, and the lady looked so jugular. Then she took the armchair by the fire herself, and said, "Who's the eldest?" "I am," said Dora, looking more like a frightened white rabbit than I've ever seen her. "Then tell me all about it." Dora looked at Alice, and began to cry. That slab of pudding in the face had totally unnerved the gentle girl. Alice's eyes were red, and her face was puffy with crying, but she spoke up for Dora, and said, Oh, please let Oswald tell. Dora can't. She's tired with the long walk. And a young man threw a piece of it in her face and—" The lady nodded, and Oswald began. He told the story from the very beginning, as he has always been taught to, though he hated to lay bare the family honours wound before a stranger, however judge-like and gimlet-eyed. He told all, not concealing the pudding-throwing, nor what the young man had said about soap. "So," he ended, "we want to give the conscience pudding to you. It's like conscience money, you know what that is, don't you? But if you really think it is soapy, and not just the young man's horridness, perhaps you'd better not let them eat it. But the figs and things are all right." When he had done, the lady said, for most of us were crying more or less, "Come, cheer up. It's Christmas time, and he's very little, your brother, I mean. And I think the rest of you seem pretty well able to take care of the honour of the family. I'll take the conscience pudding off your minds. Where are you going now?" "Home, I suppose," Oswald said, and he thought how nasty and dark and dull it would be, the fire out most likely, and farther away. "And your father's not at home, you say?" the blue gimlet lady went on. "What do you say to having tea with me, and then seeing the entertainment we have got up for our old people?" Then the lady smiled, and the blue gimlets looked quite merry. The room was so warm and comfortable, and the invitation was the last thing we expected. It was jolly of her, I do think. No one thought quite at first of saying how pleased we should be to accept her kind invitation. Instead, we all just said, "Oh," but in a tone which must have told her we meant, "Yes, please," very deeply. Oswald, this has more than once happened, was the first to restore his manners. He made a proper bow like he has been taught, and said, "Thank you very much. We should like it very much. It is very much nicer than going home. Thank you very much." I need not tell the reader that Oswald could have made up a much better speech if he had had more time to make it up in, or if he had not been so filled with mixed flusteredness and furification by the shameful events of the day. We washed our faces and hands, and had a first-rate muffin and crumpet tea with slices of cold meats and many nice jams and cakes. A lot of other people were there, most of them people who were giving the entertainment to the aged poor. After tea it was the entertainment. Songs, and conjuring, and a play called Box and Cox, very amusing, and a lot of throwing things about in it, bacon and chops and things, and minstrels. We clapped till our hands were sore. When it was over we said goodbye. In between the songs and things, Oswald had had time to make up a speech of thanks to the lady. He said, "We all thank you heartily for your goodness. The entertainment was beautiful. We shall never forget your kindness and hospitableness." The lady laughed, and said she had been very pleased to have us. A fat gentleman said, "And your teas? I hope you enjoyed those, eh?" Oswald had not had time to make up an answer to that, so he answered straight from the heart, and said, "Rather!" And everyone laughed, and slapped us boys on the back, and kissed the girls, and the gentleman who played the bones in the minstrels saw us home. We ate the cold pudding that night, and H.O. dreamed that something came to eat him, like it advises you to in the advertisements on hoardings. The grown-ups said it was the pudding, but I don't think it could have been that, because, as I have said more than once, it was so very plain. Some of H.O.'s brothers and sisters thought it was a judgment on him for pretending about who the poor children were he was collecting the money for. Oswald does not believe such a little boy as H.O. would have a real judgment made just for him and nobody else, whatever he did. But it certainly is odd. H.O. was the only one who had bad dreams, and he was also the only one who got any of the things we bought with that ill-gotten money, because, you remember, he picked a hole in the raisin paper as he was bringing the parcel home. The rest of us had nothing, unless you count the scrapings of the pudding basin, and those don't really count at all. End of The Conscience Pudding by E. Nesbit.
Amid the cold of winter, when half spent was the night.
If you enjoy CraftLit and you want to extend the magic of Christmas all year long, we gotcha. Our CraftLit membership gives you access to all of our premium annotated books for an entire year. This membership also comes with access to our book parties, watch parties, and our cozy Discord community. Visit craftlit.gumroad.com to give someone a premium membership or buy the subscription for yourself at craftlit.com/premium.
Bertie's Ride by Lady Dunboyne. Here's a nice state of things. We have run short of candles for the tree, and of course the shops will be shut tomorrow and the day after. What is to be done? Almost anything else might have been managed in some way, but a Christmas tree in semi-darkness. Can anything more dismal be imagined? And Alice Chetwynd's usually bright face looks nearly as gloomy as the picture she has called up. "What's the row?" cries schoolboy Bertie, planting two good-natured if somewhat grubby hands on his sister's shoulders. "Alice in the dumps? That is something quite new. Can't you cut some big candles in two and stick them about? Here's Cousin Mildred, ask her. She'll be sure to hit upon something." "No, don't bother her," whispers Alice, giving him a warning pat as a pretty girl some years older than themselves enters the room. "She is so disappointed at getting no letter again today. I am so sorry, for it has quite spoiled her Christmas. Hush, don't say I told you anything about it." "What mischief are you two children plotting?" Cousin Mildred tries to speak cheerily and to turn her face so that they may not see any traces of tears about her pretty blue eyes, but there is a little quiver in her voice which betrays her. In a moment Alice's arm is round her neck, and Bertie is consoling her after his rough and ready fashion. "Cheer up, Cousin Milly. I'll bet anything you'll get a letter tomorrow." "I can't do that, Bertie, I'm afraid, for the postman doesn't come on Christmas Day." "Doesn't he? What a beastly shame! I declare I'll speak to father." "No, no, your father knows all about it. It's quite right, and I'm so glad the poor old man has one day to spend comfortably with his wife and children. I don't quite know why Cecil hasn't written, but worrying about it won't do any good. Now, let us talk about something else. Alice, when can you be spared from the tree? Mother wants all the help she can get for the church dressing." "Is she down at the church now? All right, darling, I'll come in 2 minutes. Isn't it a plague about these candles? The shops are sure to be shut in Appleton the day after Christmas, and the poor children will be so disappointed if we have to put off the tree." "The poor dear school children. Oh, that is a pity. But candles, oh dear, I don't know how we can do without them. Is it quite impossible to send to Appleton today?" "Why, to say the truth, I asked father this morning, and he said there was no one to go. You see, Coachman is away for a holiday, and Sam is as busy as he can be, and there's no one else who can be trusted with a horse, and one cannot ask anybody to trudge 5 miles and back through the snow, though it is not at all deep." "And there is more snow coming, I fear," says Mildred, looking out at the grey, thick, wintry sky. "It is awfully cold. Ah, there is a feeble little ray of sunshine struggling out. Well, I must go back to my occupation of measuring flannel for the old women's petticoats. It is nice and warm for one's fingers, at any rate. And Allie, dear, tell mother I'll join her at the church as soon as ever I can. The keepers have brought us such lovely holly out of the woods. You never saw such wealth of berries. The wreaths will be splendid this year." And Mildred goes away humming a little Christmas carol and bravely trying to forget the sore anxiety that is pressing on her heart for the far-away soldier lover whose Christmas greeting she had so hoped to receive today. "Isn't she a trump?" cries Bertie, who can see and appreciate the effort his cousin is making. "I know she has half cried her eyes out when she was by herself, but she didn't mean us to find it out. I say, Alice, I'll have another try for that letter of hers, and get your candles too. Grey Plover has been roughed, and he's as sure-footed as a goat. The snow is nothing to hurt now, and I'll trot over to Appleton and be back in no time at all." "Oh, Bertie, don't! Cousin Mildred said there was a snowstorm coming, and you might get lost, like the people in the Swiss mountains." "Or the babes in the wood, eh? You little silly, don't you think I'm man enough to take care of myself?" And Master Bertie, who is 15 and a regular sturdy specimen of a blue-eyed, sunburnt, curly-haired English lad, draws himself up with great dignity and looks down patronizingly at his little sister. Alice, of course, subsides, vanquished by this appeal, but she cannot help feeling some very uncomfortable qualms of conscience when it appears that she is to be the only person admitted into the young gentleman's confidence. "Don't go bothering poor mother about it. She always gets into such a funk as if no one knew how to take care of themselves. And be sure not to say a word to Cousin Mildred. I want to surprise her by bringing her a letter by the second post. And if father asks where I am, oh, but that will be all right. I shall get back before he comes home from shooting." And Bertie is gone before his sister has time to put into words the remonstrance she has been struggling to frame. "He'll miss his dinner, poor dear," she thinks compassionately, but is consoled by the remembrance of an admirable pastry-cook's shop in Appleton, where the gingerbread is sure to be extra plentiful on Christmas Eve of all days in the year. "A real old-fashioned Christmas, father calls it," thinks Alice as she goes to the window and looks out at the whitened landscape, amongst which the leafless branches of the trees stand out like the limbs of blackened giants. The snow which has been falling at intervals for some days is not deep, but there is a heavy lowering appearance about the sky betokening that the worst is yet to come. The little birds, which Alice has been befriending ever since the winter set in, come hopping familiarly round the window, and one saucy robin gives a peck to the glass as if to intimate that a fresh supply of crumbs would be acceptable. Alice feels in her pocket for a bit of bread, and finding some fragments, hastily scatters them on the window ledge, promising a better repast by and by. Then she gives a last look at the half-dressed Christmas tree, shakes her head over the insufficient candles, and murmuring that Bertie really is the dearest boy in the world, runs off to aid her mother in decorating the old village church. Meanwhile, Grey Plover is swiftly and resolutely bearing his rider over the half-frozen snow in a manner worthy of his name. He is a handsome, strong-built pony, Squire Chetwynd's gift to his son on his last birthday, and a right goodly pair they make, at least in the fond father's eyes. Perhaps if either Mr. Chetwynd or his steady old coachman had been at home, Master Bertie would not have found it quite so easy to get his steed saddled for that 10 miles' ride, with the ground already covered with snow, and the heaviest fall that has been known for many a year visibly impending. There is a keen northeaster blowing, but Appleton lies to the west, so that for the present it only comes on the back of his neck, and Bertie turns up his collar to keep out the flakes which seem scattered about here and there in the air, and trots bravely along, whistling and talking by turns to his pony, and to a wiry little terrier, which is really Cousin Mildred's property, but in common with most other animals is deeply devoted to Bertie. "Steady, lad, steady!" and Bertie checks his steed as they descend a somewhat steep incline, bordered by high hedges, of which the one to the north is half concealed by a bank of snow. "I declare I never thought it could have grown so deep in the time," mutters Bertie to himself. "I hope it won't snow again before tonight, or I shall have some work to get home. What's the time? Just 2. All right, 2 hours more daylight at any rate, more if a fog doesn't come on. Good day, John. Merry Christmas to you," as the village carrier, his cart heavily laden with Christmas boxes and parcels, passes him, leading his old horse carefully up the hill. "The same to you, Master Bertie, and many of them. How be the Squire and Mrs. Chetwynd and—" "All well, thank you, John, but I can't stop to go through the list now. I've to get to Appleton and back as soon as I can." "To Appleton? Laws now, Master Bertie, don't 'ee do nothing of the kind. As sure as I'm alive there's awful weather coming, and you and that little pony will never get back if you don't mind." "Little pony indeed, John. Grey Plover is nearly 14 hands, and do you suppose I care for a snowstorm?" Old John points to the wall of grey cloud advancing steadily from the northeast. "You just look yonder, master. If that don't mean the worst storm that we have known for many a long year, my name's not John Salter. Well, then I must make all the more haste. If I don't turn up by church time tomorrow, you and old Moss will have to come and dig me out. Come along, Nettle," and whistling to the terrier, which has been exchanging salutations with the carrier's old half-bred collie, Bertie canters on. "I don't think I can find time to go home to luncheon," says Mrs. Chetwynd, casting an anxious eye round the half-decorated church, which presents a one-sided appearance, 2 columns being beautifully wreathed with glossy dark leaves and coral berries, shining laurel and graceful ivy, and the third as yet untouched. "Mildred, when you come back, will you and Alice bring me some biscuits, and I can eat them in the vestry? The daylight now is so short, and I think today is even darker than usual. We shall have to work very hard to get finished in time." "I'll stay with you," replies her cousin, "and Alice shall bring provisions for us both." And by this means the secret of Bertie's absence from the early dinner remains unobserved. It is snowing heavily as Alice, in fur cloak and snow boots, trips back to the church some quarter of a mile distant from her home. The girl is beginning to be very anxious about her brother, and sorely repents her extorted promise of secrecy as to his intentions. "We are getting on," says Mrs. Chetwynd, glancing round. "I wonder if your father will look in on his way back from shooting. I suppose Bertie must have gone to join him, as we have seen nothing of the boy. I hope they won't be late. The snow is getting quite deep." A hasty knocking at the church door makes Alice start and turn so pale that her cousin laughs at her for setting up nerves. Before, however, they can open it, the intruder makes his way in, and proves to be the stable helper, with a face so white and scared that the alarm is communicated to Mrs. Chetwynd. "Milly," she says faintly, "there's been some accident. Ask him, quick. Herbert's gun." "No, no," says her cousin, bent only on reassuring her. "Speak out, James. Don't you see how you are frightening your mistress?" "If you please, ma'am, Grey Plover has come home alone, and—" "The pony! Master Bertie wasn't riding?" "Yes, ma'am. He started to ride to Appleton about 1:30 o'clock." "To ride in such weather?" "Yes, ma'am. He would go, and the Squire not being at home, I could not hinder him, and now the pony's just galloped into the yard, and—" "Mary, dearest, don't look so frightened," cries Mildred, fearing her cousin is going to faint. "I dare say he got off to walk and warm himself, and the pony broke away. Bertie rides so well he would not be likely to have a fall. But the snow, isn't it quite deep in some places, James?" "Yes, ma'am. 6 or 7 feet, they say, in the drifts, though most part of the road was pretty clear this morning. But it's been snowing heavily these 2 hours and more, and nearly as dark as night, and Grey Plover must have been down some time or other, for when he came in the saddle was all over snow." Mrs. Chetwynd gives a gasp, and for a moment her cousin thinks her senses are going, but with a brave struggle she rallied her powers. James, you and the gardeners had better go off at once. 2 of you try each road to Appleton, to meet Master Bertie. Alice, dear, run up to the house and fill father's flask with cordial, and see that they take it, and a blanket, and tell someone to go and meet your father. He will know best what to do. I must go myself to look for my boy. God help me, what shall I do if he has come to harm? You cannot walk, darling. And Mildred tenderly leads her to one of the open seats, and strokes her hands in loving but vain efforts at encouragement. Don't imagine anything bad till it comes. Bertie is sure to have taken some of the dogs with them, and they would have come home to tell us if anything were wrong. There was only little Nettle at home, Mrs. Chetwynd answers with a sigh. Jerry and Nell are out shooting with Herbert, and the new dog is no use. Oh, Milly, my bright, bonny boy, where can he be? See how dreadfully dark it has grown, and the cold. Think if he should be lying helpless in the snow. About the same time on this December afternoon, a young man is getting out of the one-horse omnibus, which the George Hotel, a small third-rate inn, albeit the best in Appleton, usually sends down to meet the afternoon train from London. He is a tall, soldierly-looking person with bright, dark eyes and a brisk, imperative manner which ensures a certain amount of attention even from the surly landlord. But when, instead of demanding luncheon or any creature comforts for himself, the traveller orders a dog-cart or any sort of trap with a good horse, to take him to Mr. Chetwynd's house, 5 miles distant, the host demurs. Impossible! The omnibus horse is the only one roughed, and he has been out twice today already. Besides, there is likely to be a heavy fall of snow before night. Even if a horse and trap could get to Edenhurst, there would be no possibility of getting back before nightfall. Mine host is very sorry to disoblige the gentleman, but it is quite out of the question. The young man, who is evidently not used to stolid opposition, begins to chafe, and his dark eyes give an angry flash. However, he forces himself to speak quietly and persuasively, and even descends to bribery in his anxiety to spend his Christmas at Edenhurst. Still, the landlord remains obdurate, the fact that he has a big commercial dinner impending at 5 o'clock making him the less inclined to spare any of his men. "Well, hang it all!" cries the young man impatiently. "Then I declare I'll get there on my own legs. I can carry my bag," swinging it stoutly over his shoulder as he speaks, "and you must find some means of sending the other things over tomorrow morning at latest. It would be too tantalizing," he adds to himself, "after coming 2,000 miles to see the little woman, if we could not spend our Christmas Eve together after all." And turning a deaf ear to the landlord's remonstrances and prophecies of evil, he sets forth briskly on the road, well known to him, although untrodden for 2 long years. "Dear little soul," he's saying to himself as he strides through the snow, "what a surprise it'll be to her. I am half sorry now I did not write. Perhaps she'll be startled, but I don't believe in sudden joy hurting anyone. I wonder if she'll be altered. I hope not. The little face couldn't be sweeter than it was. And Herbert Chetwynd is a rare good fellow. What a welcome I shall get from him and his kind-hearted wife. It's almost worth toiling and broiling for 2 years in India to come home for such a Christmas. I wonder if that jolly pickle Bertie is much grown. Capital little companion he used to be, I remember. How far have I come? Oh, just past the 2nd milestone. The snow is getting plaguey deep, and I can hardly see 10 yards ahead. I can't say it is pleasant travelling. How I shall appreciate the splendid fire in the big hall fireplace at Edenhurst. They will be burning the Yule log for Christmas. How I shall enjoy taking up all the old home customs once more. I wonder if the waits go round now. What a brute I used to feel lying snug in bed and listening to the poor little shivering mortals singing outside in the frosty morning air, almost before it was light. But I believe Herbert's wife and Milly always took care that they had a warm breakfast and a toast at the kitchen fire afterwards. But, hullo, I say, what little dog are you, out alone in the snow in this lonely part of the road? Lost your master, have you, poor little beggar? Never mind, you had better follow me home to Edenhurst for tonight. They wouldn't refuse a welcome even to a stray dog on Christmas Eve. I say, you are very pressing in your attentions, my friend. I'm afraid you are on a wrong track, sniffing and prancing around me. I'm not your master, nor have I the honour of that gentleman's acquaintance, unless— By Jove! If it isn't little Nettle, the dog I gave Mildred when I went to India. What can she be doing out here alone? And what does she want me to do, I wonder? As the terrier, delighted at the sudden recognition, dances round him more energetically than ever, catches his hand and the skirts of his coat gently in her teeth, then runs on a little way ahead, looking back to see if he is following. "Lead on, I'll follow thee. That seems to be what you want me to say, eh, little Nettle? All right there." And the traveller's 2 long legs contrive to make quite as rapid progress along the road as the terrier's 4 short ones, especially as the poor little animal occasionally lights on a snowy heap softer and deeper than the rest, and is nearly lost to sight altogether for some seconds. Presently, however, in spite of all obstacles, she scurries on ahead, and stops short with a joyful, self-satisfied bark, in front of a dark object which is half sitting, half lying in a bed of partly melted snow under the hedge, an object which upon closer inspection proves to be a slight, curly-headed boy, clad in heather-coloured jacket and knickerbockers. His cap has fallen off, and his eyes are nearly closed as he leans back on his cold couch, with an expression of half-conscious suffering on his young face. "Come, this won't do!" exclaims the traveller in a tone of no small surprise and concern. "I say, young sir, have you forgotten that this is December, and not exactly the season for enjoying life in gipsy fashion?" The boy's eyes open dreamily and scan the keen brown mustached face which is bending over him, but he neither moves nor makes any response. The traveller lays a hand on his shoulder and speaks again, somewhat more peremptorily. "I say, young one, get up, do you hear? Do you want to get frozen to death?" If there is some roughness in the tone, there is none in the manner and gesture with which, dropping on one knee in the snow, the traveller proceeds to chafe the cold, nerveless hand, which in answer to this appeal the boy slowly tries to lift. He points to his left foot, which is stretched out in an uncomfortable, twisted attitude, and his new friend is not long in discovering that a sprained ankle is the cause of the mischief. A serviceable many-bladed knife is quickly produced, and the boot dexterously slid open, to the instant relief of the injured limb, which is much swollen. The boy gives a gasp of satisfaction and murmurs, "Thank you," as he makes a still unsuccessful effort to scramble to his feet. "Take care, let me give you a hand." "Poor little chap," as the patient collapses again. "Here, have a pull at this," taking a restorative from a medicine case in an inner pocket. "That's right, you'll be able to tell me about it presently. Nettle, little lass, it's a pity you can't speak, isn't it?" "How do you know the dog's name?" the boy inquires, now almost roused into curiosity. "How do I know it? Why, because she belonged to me for 6 months before I went to India, and then I gave her to the lady who I hope is to be my wife now I've come back." "What? Are you Cecil Gordon?" "The same, at your service. Cousin Sis, as your little sister used to call me, if, as I suppose, you are my old playfellow Bertie. 2 years have made a difference in your size, my lad, and this snow gave your face a blue sort of look which prevented my knowing you at first. And now tell me, what pranks have you been playing to get into such a plight?" "I rode Grey Plover to Appleton this afternoon to get some things the girls wanted, and the snowstorm came on heavily, and it got horribly dark, as you see, and somehow we stumbled into a snowdrift. I'd marked the bad places as I came and thought I could keep clear of them, but the darkness misled me and the snow got into my eyes. We rolled over together, and my foot caught in the stirrup and came out with an awful wrench, but it's ever so much better since you cut the boot open." "And then I suppose the pony made off?" "Yes, I believe so. I felt awfully sick when I got up, but I managed to crawl out of the drift, for I'd just sense enough left to mind being smothered. I don't suppose I could have lain here very long when you came, or I should have been frozen." "Well, the great thing will be to get you home as soon as may be, but the snow is getting so deep that it won't be very pleasant traveling. Can you bear to put that foot to the ground? No? Then don't try. My legs must do duty for 2.
"Oh, I'm too heavy. You'll never be able to carry me, especially through the snow."
"Nonsense. If you begin making difficulties, I shall have to treat you as one of our fellows, so the story goes, did the wounded sergeant in Zululand."
"Oh, what was that?"
"Why, the enemy was close upon them, and B, that was the officer, was bent upon rescuing the sergeant of his troops who was wounded and helpless and whose own horse had been killed. So he told him to get up behind on his horse, and the sergeant refused and told B to save himself and leave him to perish, and B answered in peremptory fashion, 'If you don't obey orders at once, I shall punch your head.'" "Don't punch mine today," says Bertie with a rather feeble laugh. "It feels so queer and top-heavy. I'll give you leave to try as soon as I'm all right again." "All right. But now about this getting home. Here, you take the bag and I'll carry you. Will you ride in ordinary pick-a-back fashion, or, as I've seen soldiers do at what they've called chummy races, lengthwise across their bearers' shoulders?" Bertie prefers the former method, and with some little difficulty is hoisted into the required position. "How are they all at home?" asks Captain Gordon after they have advanced some little way in silence.
"Very well, and very jolly. Only today Cousin Milly was out of spirits because—"
"Well, what?" The tone is sharp and impatient.
"Because you hadn't written, and she did so want a letter for Christmas, and I thought there might be one by the afternoon post. They do come then sometimes."
"And that was the reason for your taking that crazy ride through the snow? My dear little fellow," and the brisk voice is very kind and gentle now, "I am sorry to have been the cause of all this trouble."
"Oh, never mind. It was partly, too, to get Alice the candles she was bothering about for the Christmas tree. By the by, I hope they've not fallen out of my pocket. No, here they are, all right."
"I'm afraid you found no letter at the post office after all. You see, the orders for home came to us rather suddenly, and when I found I could be in England as soon as a letter could reach, I didn't write. I am so sorry it happened so."
"You had lots of real fighting among the Afghans, hadn't you?"
"Yes, I'll tell you about it some day. Just now I want my breath for something more than talking. How deep the snow is between these high hedges."
"Yes, if only we could get over into the fields it would be better. And there's a short-cut, too."
"Can we find it?"
"I'll try, but my head is so stupid somehow. Don't I hear someone whistling behind us?"
As Bertie speaks, a young labouring man comes up to them, looks with some surprise at the pair, and answers with a surly grunt to Captain Gordon's inquiry as to the nearest way to Edenhurst.
"Why, Jack, you can show us," cries Bertie impatiently. "There's a stile somewhere that leads right past your mother's cottage, and then we can get across Higgins's fields."
"If there is a cottage, I shall be glad of 5 minutes' rest by the fireside," says Cecil, who is beginning to get decidedly blown. "I was just thinking what an awfully lonely road this was." "Jack Brown is a surly fellow," whispers Bertie in his ear, but not so low but that the man catches the last words. "Surly! And who wouldn't be, young master, I'd like to know, in my place? Didn't the squire have me up for poaching, and didn't I get 3 weeks in jail along of snaring a few worthless pheasants? Much he or anyone would have cared if my old mother had starved the while." "For shame!" Bertie's wrath is making him quite energetic. "As if mother and Mildred didn't go to see the old woman nearly every day and make sure she wanted for nothing." "Well, well," interrupts Cecil, "don't rake up bygones on Christmas Eve of all days in the year. Forgive and forget. Peace and goodwill, that's what the bells always seem to me to be saying. I say, my friend, I'm sure your mother would be willing to let the young master sit by her fire for 5 minutes after he's nearly got himself killed, and buried too, riding to Appleton to do his sister and cousin a good turn." A shadow of a smile lurks on Jack's grim visage at this appeal, and he proceeds to lead the way across a difficult hog-backed stile, over which he helps to lift Bertie with more gentleness than might be expected. Then striding before them through the snow, which is more even and easy to wade through in the open field, he presently stops at the door of a little thatched cottage which is opened by a tidy old woman. Bertie is soon established in her own high-backed wooden chair by the fire, drinking hot, if somewhat hay-scented tea, and obtaining great relief from the attentions his friend is now better able to bestow upon the injured foot. Meanwhile, this is becoming a very sad Christmas Eve to the anxious watchers at Edenhurst. The squire has returned home, puzzled and half incredulous at the confused report of Master Bertie's disappearance which has reached him. But when the snow-soaked saddle and the riderless pony have been shown him, he too grows seriously alarmed, and without waiting to change his wet things, sets off in the direction of Appleton. Other messengers have already been dispatched, but the hours pass by and no news is obtained, no one happening to think of the short-cut and old Mrs. Brown's cottage. Even the bells are mute. The villagers cannot bear to ring them when their dear lady is in such trouble. She is trying hard to force herself to believe that nothing can be so very wrong. It is foolish to be so over-anxious. No one has any heart to carry on the joyous preparations for Christmas, in which Bertie usually bears an active part, but Mrs. Chetwynd will not let the poor people suffer, and their gifts of warm clothing and tea and sugar are all looked over and carefully ticketed by Mildred and Alice. Poor girls, they have little spirit for the work, but it is better for them than the dreary waiting which follows. At last Alice can bear it no longer. She throws a cloak round her and steals out into the avenue. The air is clearer now, and the snow has ceased to fall. The earth is covered with a brilliant white sheet, and overhead the wintry stars are shining out one by one in the deep blue vault. The girl begins to feel more hopeful, as the still frosty air cools her hot cheek, and the stars look down upon her with their silent greeting of peace. Glad tidings of great joy! The Christmas message of nearly 19 centuries ago. Surely it cannot be that a heart-breaking grief is to come on them on this of all nights in the year. A prayer is in her heart, on her lips, and even in that moment, as if in answer, there burst forth the most joyous of all sounds to Alice's ear, their own village bells ringing in a merry Christmas peal. It had been understood that this was to be the signal of Bertie's being found and safe. Louder and louder it comes, and eager congratulations are exchanged by the anxious watchers. Mrs. Chetwynd wants to fly to meet her boy, but is gently restrained by Mildred, who reminds her that his father must be with him, nor is it long before a happy group are seen approaching. There is Bertie, who has insisted on putting his injured foot to the ground lest his mother should be frightened by seeing him carried, bravely hopping along with the aid of his father's strong arm, faithful little Nettle trotting close at his side, and Jack Brown, with whom the squire has shaken hands and exchanged a Merry Christmas, slouching behind. But who is the tall figure on Bertie's other side? Ah, Cousin Mildred knows, and well it is, perhaps, that the growing darkness throws a friendly veil over the joyous blushes and the happy, thankful tears that mark that meeting.
A Recruit at Christmas by Richard Harding Davis, 1892. Young Lieutenant Claflin left the Brooklyn Navy Yard at an early hour and arrived at the recruiting office at 10 o'clock. It was the day before Christmas, and even the Bowery, the thieves' highway, had taken on the emblems and spirit of the season, and the young officer smiled grimly as he saw a hard-faced proprietor of a saloon directing the hanging of wreaths and crosses over the door of his place, and telling the assistant barkeeper to make the red holly berries show up better. The cheap lodging houses had trailed the green over their illuminated transoms, and even on Mott Street, the Chinamen had hung up strings of evergreen over the doors of the Joss House and the gambling house next door. And the tramps and good-for-nothings, just back from the island, had an animated, expectant look, as though something certainly was going to happen. Lieutenant Claflin nodded to Corporal Goddard at the door of the recruiting office and startled that veteran's rigidity, and kept his cotton-gloved hand at his visor longer than the regulations required by saying, "Wish you a Merry Christmas," as he jumped up the stairs. The recruiting office was a dull, blank-looking place. The view from the windows was not inspiring, and the sight of the plump and black-eyed Jewess in front of the pawn shop across the street, who was a vision of delight to Corporal Goddard, had no attractions to the officer upstairs. He put on his blue jacket with the black braid down the front, lighted a cigar, and wrote letters on every other than official matters, and forgot about recruits. He was to have leave of absence on Christmas, and though the others had denounced him for leaving the mess table on that day, they had forgiven him when he explained that he was going to spend it with his people at home. The others had homes as far away as San Francisco and as far inland as Milwaukee, and some called the big ship of war home, but Claflin's people lived up in Connecticut, and he could reach them in a few hours. He was a very lucky man, the others said, and he felt very cheerful over it, and forgot the blank-looking office with its rules and regulations and colored prints of uniforms and models of old warships and tin boxes of official documents which were to be filled out and sent to the Honorable, the Secretary of the Navy. Corporal Goddard, on the stoop below, shifted from one foot to the other and chafed his gloved hands softly together to keep them warm. He had no time to write letters on unofficial writing paper, nor to smoke cigars or read novels with his feet on a chair, with the choice of looking out at the queer stream of human life moving by below the window on the opposite side of the Bowery. He had to stand straight, which came easily to him now, and to answer questions and urge doubtful minds to join the ranks of the government's Marines. A drunken man gazed at Ogden's colored pictures of the American infantry, cavalry, and Marine uniforms that hung before the door, and placed an unsteady finger on the cavalryman's picture, and said he chose to be one of those. Corporal Goddard told him severely to be off and get sober and grow 6 inches before he thought of such a thing, and frowned him off the stoop. Then 2 boys from the country asked about the service, and went off very quickly when they found that they would have to remain in it for 3 years at least. A great many more stopped in front of the gay pictures and gazed admiringly at Corporal Goddard's bright brass buttons and brilliant complexion, which they innocently attributed to exposure to the sun on long, weary marches, but no one came to offer himself in earnest. At 1 o'clock, Lieutenant Claflin changed his coat and went downtown to luncheon, and came back still more content and in feeling with the season, and lighted another cigar. But just as he had settled himself comfortably, he heard Corporal Goddard's step on the stairs, and a less determined step behind him. He took his feet down from the rung on the other chair, pulled his undressed jacket into place, and took up a pen. Corporal Goddard saluted at the door and introduced with a wave of his hand the latest applicant for Uncle Sam's service. The applicant was as young as Lieutenant Claflin, and as good-looking, but he was dirty and unshaven, and his eyes were set back in the sockets, and his fingers twitched at his side. Lieutenant Claflin had seen many applicants in this stage. He called it the remorseful stage, and he was used to it. "Name?" said Lieutenant Claflin as he pulled a printed sheet of paper towards him. The applicant hesitated. Then he said, "Walker? John Walker?" The lieutenant noticed the hesitation, but he merely remarked to himself, "It's none of my business," and added aloud, "Nationality?" and wrote United States before the applicant answered. The applicant said he was unmarried, he was 23 years old, and he had been born in New York City. Even Corporal Goddard knew this last was not so, but it was none of his business either. He moved the applicant up against the wall under the measuring rod and brought it down on his head. So he measured and weighed the applicant and tested his eyesight with printed letters and bits of colored yarn, and the lieutenant kept tally on the sheet and bit the end of his pen and watched the applicant's face. There were a great many applicants, and few were chosen, but none of them had quite the air about him which this one had. Lieutenant Claflin thought Corporal Goddard was just a bit too callous in the way he handled the applicant, and too peremptory in his questions, but he could not tell why Corporal Goddard treated them all in that way. Then The young officer noticed that the applicant's white face was flushing, and that he bit his lips when Corporal Goddard pushed him towards the weighing machine, as we would have moved a barrel of flour. "You'll answer," said Lieutenant Claflin, glancing at his sheet. "Your average is very good. All you've got to do now is to sign this, and then it will be over." But he did not let go of the sheet in his hand as he would have done had he wanted it over. Neither did the applicant move forward to sign. "After you've signed this," said the young officer, keeping his eyes down on the paper before him, "you will have become a servant of the United States. You will sit in that other room until the office is closed for today, and then you will be led over to the Navy Yard and put into a uniform, and from that time on, for 3 years, you will have a number, the same number as the one on your musket. You and the musket will both belong to the government. You will clean and load the musket, and fight with it if God ever gives us the chance, and the government will feed you and keep you clean and fight with you if needful." The lieutenant looked up at the corporal and said, "You can go, Goddard." And the corporal turned on his heel and walked downstairs, wondering. "You may spend the 3 years," continued the officer, still without looking at the applicant, "which are the best years of a young man's life, on the sea, visiting foreign ports, or you may spend it marching up and down the Brooklyn Navy Yard and cleaning brasswork. There are some men who are meant to clean brasswork and to march up and down in front of the stone arsenal, and who are fitted for nothing else. But to every man is given something which should tell him that he is put here to make the best of himself. Every man has that, even the men who are only fit to clean brass rods. But some men kill it, or try to kill it, in different ways, generally by rum, and they are as generally successful, if they keep the process up long enough. The government, of which I am a very humble representative, is always glad to get good men to serve her. But it seems to me, and I may be wrong, and I'm quite sure that I'm speaking contrary to regulations, that some of her men serve her better in other ways than swapping down decks. Now, you know yourself best. It may be that you are just the sort of man to stand up and salute the ladies when they come on board to see the ship, and to watch them from forward as they walk about with the officers. You won't be allowed to speak to them. You will be number 329 or 328, and whatever benefits a good woman can give a man will be shut off from you, more or less, for 3 years. And on the other hand, it may be that there are some good women who could keep you on shore and help you do something more with yourself than to carry a musket. And again, it may be that if you stayed on shore, you would drink yourself more or less comfortably to death and break somebody's heart. I can't tell. But if I were not a commissioned officer of the United States, and a thing of rules and regulations, who can dance and wear a uniform, and a youth generally unfit to pose as an example, I would advise you not to sign this, but to go home and brace up and leave the whiskey alone. Now, what shall we do?" said the young lieutenant, smiling. "Shall we tear this up, or will you sign it?" The applicant's lips now were twitching, as well as his hands, and he rubbed his cuff over his face and smiled back. "I'm much obliged to you," he said nervously. "That sounds a rather flat thing to say, I know, but if you knew all I meant by it, though, it would mean enough. I've made a damn fool of myself in this city, but nothing worse. And it was the choice of the Navy, where they'd keep me straight, or going to the devil my own way. But it won't be my own way now, thanks to you. I don't know how you saw how it was so quickly, but, you see, I have got a home back in Connecticut, and women that can help me there. And I'll go back to them and ask them to let me start in again, where I was when I went away." "That's good," said the officer cheerfully. "That's the way to talk. Tell me where you live in Connecticut, and I'll lend you the car fare to get there. I'll expect it back with interest, you know," he said, laughing. "Thank you," said the rejected applicant. "It's not so far that I can't walk, and I don't think you'd believe me if I took the money." "Oh, yes, I would," said the lieutenant. "How much do you want?" "Thank you, but I'd rather walk," said the other. "I can get there easily enough by tomorrow. I'll be a nice Christmas present, won't I?" he added grimly. "You'll do," said the young officer. "I fancy you'll be about as welcome a one as they'll get." He held out his hand, and the other shook it, and walked out with his shoulders as stiff as those of Corporal Goddard. Then he came back and looked into the room shyly. "I say," he said hesitatingly. The lieutenant ran his hand down into his pocket. "You changed your mind?" he asked eagerly. "That's good. How much will you want?" The rejected applicant flushed. "No, not that," he said. "I just came back to say, wish you a Merry Christmas." If you have a book lover in your life, or even someone who's neurodivergent or obsessed with the Wicked musical, come check out our Gumroad shop. We have annotated classics, a neurodivergent planner, and even 9+ hours of The Wizard of Oz as an annotated audiobook. You can find them all on craftlit.gumroad.com. That's craftlit, CRAFTLIT, .gumroad, GUM as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com. Or you could buy them as a gift. Happy holidays, and take care of yourself, your friends, and your family.
Christmas Every Day by W.D. Howells, read in English, adapted as a radio play by Brian Hostick and Jessica Mells. My little girl came into my study, and as she always did Saturday mornings before breakfast, asked for a story. I tried to beg off, for I was very busy, but she wouldn't let me, so I began. Well, once there was a little pig.
Papa, I've heard little pig stories till I'm perfectly sick of them.
Well, what kind of story shall I tell then?
About Christmas. It's getting to be the season. It's past Thanksgiving already.
It seems to me that I've told as often about Christmas as I have about little pigs.
No difference. Christmas is more interesting.
Well, okay. Well, then I'll tell you about the little girl that wanted it Christmas every day in the year. How would you like that?
First rate.
Very well, then. This little pig... Hey, what are you hitting me for?
Because you said little pig instead of little girl.
I should like to know what's the difference between a little pig and a little girl that wanted it Christmas every day.
Papa, if you don't go on, I'll give it to you.
Well, once there was a little girl who liked Christmas so much that she wanted it to be Christmas every day in the year, and as soon as Thanksgiving was over she began to send postal cards to the old Christmas fairy to ask if she mightn't have it. But the old fairy never answered any of the postals, and after a while the little girl found out that the fairy was pretty particular and wouldn't notice anything but letters. Not even correspondence cards and envelopes, but real letters on sheets of paper and sealed outside with a monogram, or your initial anyway. So then she began to send her letters, and in about 3 weeks, or just the day before Christmas it was, she got a letter from the fairy, saying she might have it Christmas every day for a year, and then they would see about having it longer. The little girl was a good deal excited already, preparing for the old-fashioned once-a-year Christmas that was coming the next day, and perhaps the fairy's promise didn't make much of an impression on her as it would have at some other time. She just resolved to keep it to herself and surprise everybody with it as it kept coming true, and then it slipped out of her mind altogether. She had a splendid Christmas. She went to bed early so as to let Santa Claus have a chance at the stockings, and in the morning she was up the first of anybody, and went and felt them, and found hers all lumpy with packages of candy and oranges and grapes, and pocketbooks and rubber balls and all kinds of small presents, and her big brothers with nothing but the tongs in them, and her young lady sisters with a new silk umbrella, and her papas and mammas with potatoes and pieces of coal wrapped up in tissue paper, just as they always had every Christmas. Then she waited around till the rest of the family were up, and she was the first to burst into the library when the doors were opened, and look at the large presents laid out on the library table. Books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins and dolls and little stoves and dozens of handkerchiefs and inkstands and skates and snow shovels and photograph frames and little easels and boxes of watercolors and Turkish paste and nougat and candied cherries and dolls' houses and waterproofs and the big Christmas tree lighted and standing in a wastebasket in the middle. She had a splendid Christmas all day. She ate so much candy that she did not want any breakfast, and the whole forenoon the presents kept pouring in that the expressmen had not had time to deliver the night before, and she went round giving the presents she had got for other people, and came home and ate turkey and cranberry for dinner, and plum pudding and nuts and raisins and oranges and more candy, and then went out and coasted and came in with a stomachache crying. And her papa said he would see if his house was turned into that sort of fool's paradise another year, and they had a light supper, and pretty early everybody went to bed cross. Well, now what? Did I say pigs?
You made them act like pigs.
Well, didn't they?
No matter, you ought to put that into a story.
Very well then, I'll take it all out. The little girl slept very heavily, and she slept very late, but she was wakened at last by the other children dancing round her bed with their stockings full of presents in their hands. "What is it?" said the little girl, and she rubbed her eyes and tried to rise up in bed. "Christmas, Christmas, Christmas!" they all shouted and waved their stockings. Nonsense, it was Christmas yesterday. Her brothers and sisters just laughed. "We don't know about that. It's Christmas today anyway. You come into the library and see." Then all at once it flashed on the little girl that the fairy was keeping her promise, and her year of Christmases was beginning. She was dreadfully sleepy, but she sprang up like a lark that had overeaten itself and gone to bed cross, and darted into the library. There it was again, books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins.
You needn't go over it all, Papa. I guess I could remember just what was there.
Well, and there was the Christmas tree blazing away, and the family picking out their presents, but looking pretty sleepy, and her father perfectly puzzled, and her mother ready to cry. "I'm sure I don't see how I'm to dispose of all these things," said her mother, and her father said it seemed to him they had had something like it the day before, but he supposed he must have dreamed it. This struck the little girl as the best kind of a joke, and so she ate so much candy she didn't want any breakfast, and went round carrying presents, and had a turkey and cranberry for dinner, and then went out and coasted, and came in with a...
Papa!
"Well, what now?"
What did you promise, you forgetful thing?
Oh, yes. Well, the next day it was just the same thing over again, but everybody getting crosser, and at the end of a week's time so many people had lost their tempers that you could pick up lost tempers anywhere. They perfectly strewed the ground. Even when people tried to recover their tempers, they usually got somebody else's, and it made the most dreadful mix. The little girl began to get frightened, keeping the secret all to herself. She wanted to tell her mother, but she didn't dare to, and she was ashamed to ask the fairy to take back her gift. It seemed ungrateful and ill-bred, and she thought she would try to stand it, but she hardly knew how she could for a whole year. So it went on, and it was Christmas on St. Valentine's Day and Washington's birthday, just the same as any day, and it didn't skip even the 1st of April, though everything was counterfeit that day, and that was some little relief. After a while, coal and potatoes began to be awfully scarce. So many had been wrapped up in tissue paper to fool papas and mammas with. Turkeys got to be about $1,000 apiece.
Papa,
What?
you're beginning to fib.
Well, 2,000 then. And they got to passing off almost anything for turkeys. Half-grown hummingbirds, and even rocks out of the Arabian Nights. The real turkeys were so scarce. And cranberries? Well, they asked $1 apiece for cranberries. All the woods and orchards were cut down for Christmas trees, and where the woods and orchards used to be, it looked just like a stubble field with the stumps. After a while they had to make Christmas trees out of rags and stuff them with bran like old-fashioned dolls, but there were plenty of rags because people got so poor, buying presents for one another, that they couldn't get any new clothes, and they just wore their old ones to tatters. They got so poor that everybody had to go to the poorhouse, except the confectioners and the fancy storekeepers and the picture book sellers and the expressmen, and they all got so rich and proud that they would hardly wait upon a person when he came to buy. It was perfectly shameful. Well, after it had gone on for about 3 or 4 months, the little girl, whenever she came into the room in the morning and saw those great ugly lumpy stockings dangling at the fireplace, and the disgusting presents around everywhere, used to just sit down and burst out crying. In 6 months she was perfectly exhausted. She couldn't even cry any more. She just lay on the lounge and rolled her eyes and panted. About the beginning of October she took to sitting down on dolls wherever she found them, French dolls or any kind. She hated the sight of them so. And by Thanksgiving she was crazy and just slammed her presents across the room. By that time people didn't carry presents around nicely anymore. They flung them over the fence or through the window or anything. And instead of running their tongues out and taking great pains to write for dear Papa or Mama or brother or sister or Susie or Sammy or Billy or Bobby or Jimmy or Jenny or whoever it was, and troubling to get the spelling right and then signing their names and Christmas with the year, they used to write in the gift books, "Take it, you horrid thing," and then go and bang it against the front door. Nearly everybody had built barns to hold their presents, but pretty soon the barns overflowed, and then they used to let them lie out in the rain or anywhere. Sometimes the police used to come and tell them to shovel their presents off the sidewalk or they would arrest them.
I thought you said everybody had gone to the poorhouse.
Well, they did go at first, but after a while the poorhouses got so full that they had to send the people back to their own houses. And they tried to cry when they got back, but they couldn't make the least sound.
Why couldn't they?
Because they had lost their voices saying Merry Christmas so much. Did I tell you how it was on the 4th of July?
No, how was it?
Well, the night before, the boys stayed up to celebrate as they always do, and fell asleep before 12 o'clock as usual, expecting to be wakened by the bells and cannon. But it was nearly 8 o'clock before the first boy in the United States woke up, and then he found out what the trouble was. As soon as he could get his clothes on, he ran out of the house and smashed a big cannon torpedo down on the pavement. But it didn't make any more noise than a damp wad of paper. And after he tried about 20 or 30 more, he began to pick them up and look at them. Every single torpedo was a big raisin. Then he just streaked it upstairs and examined his firecrackers and toy pistol and $2 collection of fireworks, and found that they were nothing but sugar and candy painted to look like fireworks. Before 10 o'clock, every boy in the United States found out that his 4th of July things had turned into Christmas things, and then they just sat down and cried, they were so mad. There are about 20 million boys in the United States, so you can imagine what a noise they made. Some men got together before night with a little powder that hadn't turned into purple sugar yet, and they said they would fire off one cannon anyway. But the cannon burst into 1,000 pieces, for it was nothing but rock candy, and some of the men nearly got killed. The 4th of July orations all turned into Christmas carols, and when anybody tried to read the Declaration, instead of saying, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary," he was sure to sing, "God rest you merry gentlemen." It was perfectly awful.
And how was it at Thanksgiving?
Well, I'm almost afraid to tell you. I'm afraid you'll think it's wicked.
Well, tell anyway.
Well, before it came Thanksgiving, it had leaked out who had caused all these Christmases. The little girl had suffered so much that she had talked about it in her sleep, and after that hardly anybody would play with her. People just perfectly despised her, because if it had not been for her greediness, it wouldn't have happened. And now when it came Thanksgiving and she wanted them to go to church and have squash pie and turkey and show their gratitude, they said that all the turkeys had been eaten up for her old Christmas dinners, and if she would stop the Christmases, they would see about the gratitude. Wasn't it dreadful? And the very next day the little girl began to send letters to the Christmas fairy and then telegrams to stop it. But it didn't do any good. And then she got to calling at the fairy's house, but the girl that came to the door always said, "Not at home," or "engaged," or "at dinner," or something like that. And so it went on till it came to the old once-a-year Christmas Eve. The little girl fell asleep, and when she woke up in the morning,
She found it was all nothing but a dream.
no, indeed, it was all every bit true.
Well, what did she find out then?
Why, that it wasn't Christmas at last, and wasn't ever going to be any more. All right, now it's time for breakfast.
You shan't go if you're going to leave it so.
How do you want it left?
Christmas once a year.
All right. Well, there was the greatest rejoicing all over the country, and it extended clear up into Canada. The people met together everywhere and kissed and cried for joy. The city carts went around and gathered up all the candy and raisins and nuts and dumped them into the river, and it made the fish perfectly sick. And the whole United States as far out as Alaska was one blaze of bonfires, where the children were burning up their gift books and presents of all kinds. They had the greatest time. The little girl went to thank the old fairy because she had stopped its being Christmas, and she said she hoped she would keep her promise and see that Christmas never came again. But then the fairy frowned and asked her if she was sure she knew what she meant, and the little girl asked her why not. And the old fairy said that now she was behaving just as greedily as ever, and she'd better look out. This made the little girl think it all over carefully again, and she said she would be willing to have it Christmas about once in 1,000 years. And then she said 100, and then she said 10, and at last she got down to 1. Then the fairy said that was the good old way that had pleased people ever since Christmas began, and she was agreed. Then the little girl said, "What are your shoes made of?" And the fairy said, "Leather." And the little girl said, "Bargain's done forever," and skipped off and hippity-hopped the whole way home. She was so glad. How will that do?
First rate.
And just then my wife popped her head in the door.
Are you never coming to breakfast? What have you been telling that child?
Oh, just a moral tale.
We know. Don't you tell what, Papa? Don't you tell what?
End of Christmas Every Day by W.D. Howells.
"Times have changed," said old Scrooge as he sat by my fireside on Christmas Eve. The Christmas carol had been read, as our custom was, and the children had gone to bed, so that only Scrooge and I remained to watch the dying embers. "Times have changed, and I'm not appreciated as I was in the middle of the last century. People don't seem to be having so good a time. You remember the Christmas when I was converted? What larks! Up to that time I had been a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Those were the very words that described me. Then the Christmas spirit took possession of me, and presto, change! All at once I became a new creature. I began to hurry about, giving all sorts of things to all sorts of people. You remember how I scattered turkeys all over the neighborhood, shouting, "Here's the turkey! Hello! Whoop! How are you? Merry Christmas!" And then I sat down and chuckled over my generosity till I cried. I was having the time of my life, you see. I hadn't been used to that sort of thing, and it went to my head. And how grateful everybody was. They took everything in the spirit of which it was offered, and asked no questions. Everywhere there was an outstretched hand and a fervent "God bless you" for every gift. Nobody twitted me about the past. I was all at once elevated to the position of an earthly providence. Talk of fun! Was there ever such a practical joke as to scare Bob Cratchit within an inch of his life, and then raise his salary before he could even say Jack Robinson? You should have seen him jump. How the little Cratchits shouted for joy. And when the thing was written up, all Anglo-Saxondom was smiling through its tears and saying, "That's just like us. God bless us, everyone." But it's different now. Something has got into the Christmas spirit. Doing good just doesn't seem such a jolly thing as it once was, and you can't carry it off with a whoop and a hello. People are getting critical. In these days, a charitable shilling doesn't go so far as it used to, and doesn't buy nearly so many God bless yous. You complain of the rise in the price of necessities of life. It isn't a circumstance to the increase in the cost of luxuries like benevolence. Almost everyone looks forward to the time when he can afford to be generous, and when he is generous, he likes to feel generous and to have other people sympathize with him. It's only human nature. A man can't be thinking about himself all the time. He gets that tired feeling that your scientific people in these days call altruism. It is an inability to concentrate his mind on his own concerns. In spite of himself, his thoughts wander off to other people's affairs, and he has an impulse to do them good. Now, in my day, it was the easiest thing in the world to do good. The only thing necessary was to feel good-natured, and there you were. Nowadays, the way of the benefactor is hard. It's so difficult that I understand you actually have schools of philanthropy. Scrooge shrugged his shoulders and seemed to shrivel at the thought of these horrible institutions. "Just fancy," he continued, "how I should have felt on that blessed Christmas night if, instead of starting off as an amateur angel, feeling my wings growing every moment, I had been compelled to prepare for an entrance examination. I suppose I should have been put with backwards pupils whose early education had been neglected, and should have had to learn the ABCs of charity. School of philanthropy, blah! And on the holidays, too. I have been visiting some elderly gentlemen who have had something of my experience with the spirit of Christmas. Like me, they were converted somewhat late in life. They never were in as bad a way as I was, for I did business, you may remember, in a narrow street with quite sordid surroundings, while they were financiers in a large way. Yet I suppose that they, too, were squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinners, though nobody had the courage to tell them so. Then they got tired of clutching, and their hearts warmed and their hands relaxed, and they began to give. Never was such a giving known before. It was a perfect deluge of beneficence. A mere catalogue of the gifts would make a Christmas carol of itself. But, would you believe it, they never have got the fun out of it that I got when I filled the cab full of turkeys and set out for Camden Town. The old Christmas feeling seems to have been chilled. The public has grown critical. Instead of dancing for joy, it looks suspiciously at the gifts and asks, where did they get them? It has been so impressed by the germ theory of disease that it foolishly fears that even money may be tainted. It's a preposterous situation. Generosity is a drug on the market, and gratitude can't be had at any reasonable price. Yes, I said, you're quite right. Public sentiment has changed. Gratitude is not so easily won as it was in your day, and it takes longer to transform a clutching, covetous old sinner into a serviceable philanthropist. But I do not think, Scrooge, that the Christmas spirit has really vanished. He is only a little chastened and subdued by the spirit of democracy." "I don't see what democracy has to do with it," said Scrooge. "I'm sure that nobody ever accused me of being an aristocrat. What I'm troubled about is the decay of gratitude. If I give a poor fellow a shilling, I ought to be allowed the satisfaction of having him remove his hat and say, 'Thank you, sir.' And he ought to say it as if he meant it. The heartiness of his thanksgiving is half the fun. It makes one feel good all over." "But," I answered, "if the fellow happens to have a good memory, he may recall the fact that yesterday you took 2 shillings from him, and he may think that the proper response to your sudden act of generosity is, 'Where's that other shilling?' That's what the spirit of democracy puts him up to. It's not so polite, but you must admit that it goes right to the point." "I don't like it," said Scrooge. "I thought you wouldn't. There are a great many people who don't like it. It's a twitting on facts that takes away a good deal of the pleasure of being generous." "I should say it did," grumbled Scrooge. "It makes you feel mean just when you're the most sensitive. Just think how I should have felt if, when I gave Bob Cratchit a dig in the waistcoat and told him that I had raised his salary, he had taken the opportunity to ask for back pay. It would have been most inopportune." "You owed it to him, didn't you?" "Yes, I suppose I did, if you choose to put it that way, but Bob wouldn't have put it that way. He wouldn't take such liberties. He took what I gave him, and when I gave him more than he expected, he was all the happier, and so was I. That's what made it all seem so nice and Christmassy. We were not thinking about rights and duties. It was all free grace." "Now, Scrooge, you are getting at the point. There's no concealing the fact that the spirit of democracy makes himself unpleasant sometimes. He breaks up the old pleasant relations existing not only between the lords and the commons, but between you and Bob Cratchit. Man is naturally a superstitious creature, and is prone to worship the first thing that comes in his way. When a poor fellow sees a person who is better off than himself, he jumps to the conclusion that he is a better man, and bows before him, as before a wonder-working providence. When this providence smiles upon him, he is glad, and receives the bounty with devout thankfulness. Is that what the old theologians used to call an uncovenanted mercy? All of this is very pleasant to one who can sign himself by the grace of God, or president of a coal company, or some such thing as that. The gratification extends to all the minor grades of greatness as well. The great man is ordained to give as it pleases him, and the little man to receive with due meekness. The great man is always the man who has something, I suppose, Scrooge, that in your busy life, first scraping money together and then dispensing it in your joyous Christmassy way, you have had not much time for general reading, or even for listening to sermons. "I have always attended a divine service since my conversion," answered Scrooge piously. "As for listening—" Well, what I was going to say was that if you had attended to such matters, you must have noticed how much of the literature of goodwill is devoted to the praise of the blessed inequalities, how the changes are rung on the strong and the weak, the wise and the ignorant, the rich and the poor, especially the poor, who form the hub of the philanthropic universe. Nobody seems to meet another on the level. Everybody is either looking up or looking down, and they're taught how to do it. I remember attending the annual meeting of the Society for the Relief of Indigent Children. The indigent children were first fed and then insulted by a plethoric gentleman, who addressed to them a long discourse on indigence and the various duties that it entailed. And no one of the children was allowed to throw things at the speaker. They had all been taught to look grateful. Now, these inequalities do exist, and so long as they exist, all sorts of helpful offices have place. The trouble is that good people are all doing their best to make the inequalities permanent. You have heard how divines have interpreted the text, "The poor you always have with you." The good old doctrine has been that the relation between those who have not and those who have should be that of one-sided dependence. The ignorance must depend on the wise, the weak upon the strong, the poor upon the rich. As for the black, yellow, and various party-colored races, they must depend on the white man, who gaily walks off with their burdens without so much as a by your leave. Now it is against this whole theory, however beautifully or piously expressed, that the protest has come. The spirit of democracy is a bold iconoclast, and goes about smashing our idols. He laughs at the pretensions of the strong and the wise and the rich to have created the things they possess. They are not the masters of the feast. They are only those of us who have got at the head of the line, sometimes by unmannerly pushing, and have secured a place at the first table. We are not here by their leave, and we may go directly to the source of supplies. They are not benefactors, but beneficiaries. The spirit of democracy insists that they shall know their place. He rebukes even the captains of industry, and when they answer insolently, he suggests that they be reduced to the ranks. Even towards bishops and other clergy his manner lacks that perfect reverence that belonged to an earlier time, yet he listens to them respectfully when they talk sense. It is this spirit that plays the mischief with many of the merry old ways of doing good. To scatter turkeys or colleges among a multitude of gratefully dependent folks is the very poetry of philanthropy. But to satisfy the curiosity of an independent citizen, as to your title of these things, is a different matter. The more independent people are, the harder it is to do good to them. They are apt to have their own ideas of what they want. "It's a pity, then, to have taken them so independent," said Scrooge. "It spoils people to get above their proper station in life." "Ah, there you are," I answered. "I feared it would come to that. With all your exuberant goodwill, you haven't altogether got beyond the theory that has come down from the time when the first cave-dweller bestowed on his neighbor the bone he himself didn't need, and established the pleasant relation of benefactor and beneficiary. It gave him such a warm feeling in his heart that he naturally wanted to make the relation permanent. First cave-dweller felt a little disappointed next day when second cave-dweller, instead of coming to him for another bone, preferred to take his pointed stick and go hunting on his own account. It seemed a little ungrateful to him, and first cave-dweller felt that it would be no more than right to arrange legislation in the cave so that this should not happen again. Christian charity is a very beautiful thing, but sometimes it gets mixed up with these ideas of the cave-dwellers. Sometimes it perpetuates the very evils that it laments. Perhaps you won't mind my reading a bit from a homily of St. Augustine on this very subject. St. Augustine was a man who was a very good many centuries ahead of his time. He begins his argument by saying, "All love, dear brethren, consists in wishing well to those who are loved." This seems like a harmless proposition. It's the sort of thing you might hear in a sermon and think no more about it. But St. Augustine goes on to the root of the matter and asks what it means to wish well to the person you're trying to help. He comes to the conclusion that if you really wish him well, you must wish him to be at least as well off and as well able to take care of himself as you are. The first thing you know, you're wishing him to have reach a point where he will not look up to you at all. There is a certain friendliness by which we desire at one time or another to do good to those we love, but how if there be no good that we can do? We ought not to wish men to be wretched, that we may be enabled to practice works of mercy. Thou givest bread to the hungry, but better were it that none hungered, and that thou hadst none to give to. Thou clothest the naked, oh, that all men were clothed, and that this need existed not. Take away the wretched, and the works of mercy will be at an end. But shall the ardor of charity be quenched? With a truer touch of love thou lovest the happy man to whom there is no good office that thou canst do. Purer will that love be, and more unalloyed. For if thou hast done a kindness to the wretched, perhaps thou wishest him to be subject to thee. He was in need, thou didst bestow, thou seemest to thyself greater, because thou didst bestow, than he upon whom it was bestowed. Wish him to be thine equal. There, Scrooge, is the text for the little Christmas sermon that I should like to preach to you, and to your elderly, wealthy friends who feel that they are not so warmly appreciated as they once were. Wish him to be thine equal. That is the test of charity. It's all right to give a poor devil a turkey, but are you anxious that he shall have as good a chance as you have to buy a turkey for himself? Are you really enthusiastic about so equalizing opportunities that by and by You shall be surrounded by happy, self-reliant people who have no need of your benefactions. Do you know, Scrooge, I sometimes think that it is time for someone to write a new Christmas carol, a carol that will make the world know how people are feeling and some of the best things they're doing in these days. It should be founded on justice and not on mercy. We should feed up Bob Cratchit and put some courage in him. And he should come to you and ask for a living wage, not as a favor, but as a right. And you, Scrooge, would not be offended at him, but you'd sit down like a sensible man and figure it out with him. And when the talk was over, you wouldn't feel particularly generous, and he wouldn't feel particularly grateful. It would be simple business. But you would like each other better, and the business would seem more worthwhile. And then, when you went out with the spirit of Christmas, you would ask the spirit of democracy to go with you and show you the new things that are most worth seeing. He wouldn't wait for the night, for the cheeriest things would be those that go on during business hours. He would show you some sights to make your heart glad. He would show you vast numbers of persons who have got tired of the worship of the blessed inequalities and who are going in for the equalities. They have a suspicion that there is not so much difference between the great and the small as has been supposed, and that what difference there is does not prevent a frank comradeship and a perfect understanding. They think it is better to work with people than to work for them. They think that one of the inalienable rights of man is the right to make his own mistakes and to learn the lesson from them without too much prompting. So they are a little shy of many of the more intrusive forms of philanthropy. But you should see what they're up to. The spirit of democracy will take you to visit a school that is not at all like the school you used to go to, Scrooge. The teacher has forgotten his rod and his rules and his airs of superiority. He is not teaching at all, so far as you can see. He is the center of a group of eager learners who are using their own wits and not depending on his. They are so busy observing, comparing, reasoning, and finding out things for themselves that he can hardly get a word in edgewise. And he seems to like it, though it is clear that if they keep on at this rate, they will soon get ahead of their teacher. And this spirit of democracy will take you to a children's court, where the judge does not seem like a judge at all, but like a big brother, who shows the boys what they ought to do and sees that they do it. He will take you to a little republic, where boys and girls who have defied laws that they did not understand are making laws of their own and enforcing them in a way that makes the ordinary citizen feel ashamed of himself. They do it all so naturally that you wonder that nobody had thought of the plan before. He will take you to pleasant houses in unpleasant parts of the city, and there you will meet pleasant young people who are having a very good time with their neighbors and who are getting to be rather proud of their neighborhood. After you have had a cup of tea, they may talk over with you the neighborhood problems. If you have any sensible suggestion to make, these young people will listen to you. But if you begin to talk condescendingly about the poor, they'll change the subject. They're not philanthropists. They're only neighbors. I hope he may take you, Scrooge, this spirit of democracy, to some of the charity organizations I know about. I realize that you are prejudiced against that sort of thing. It seems so cold and calculating compared with your impulsive way of doing good. And you'll probably quote the lines about organized charity scrimped and iced in the name of a cautious statistical Christ. Never mind about the statistics. They only mean that these people are doing business on a larger scale than did all the good people who could carry the details in their heads. What I want you to notice is the way in which the scientific interest does away with that patronizing pity that was the hardest thing to bear in the old-time charities. These modern experts go about mending broken fortunes in very much the same way in which surgeons mend broken bones. The patient doesn't feel under any oppressive weight of obligation. He's given them such a good opportunity to show their skill. And the doctors have caught this spirit too. Instead of looking wise and waiting for people to come to them in the last extremity, they have enlisted in social service. You should see them going about opening windows and forcing people to poke their heads out in the night air and making landlords miserable by their calculations about cubic feet and investigating sweatshops and analyzing foodstuffs. It is their way of bringing in a Merry Christmas. And the spirit of democracy will take you to workshops, where you may see a new kind of captain of industry in friendly consultation with the new kind of labor leader. For the new captain is not a chief of banditti, interested only in the booty he can get for himself, and the new leader is not a conspirator waiting for a chance to plunge his knife into the more successful bandit's back. These two are responsible members of a great industrial army, and they realize their responsibility. They have not met to exchange compliments. They are not sentimentalists, but shrewd men of affairs who have met to plan a campaign for the common welfare. They don't take any credit for it, for they do not expect to give to any man any more than is due. Yet there are a good many Christmas dinners involved in the cool, business-like consultation. Afterwards, the spirit of democracy will take you to a church, where the minister is preaching from the text, "Ye are all kings and priests," as if he believed it. And you will believe it too, and go on your way wondering at the many sacred offices in the world. You will hurry on from the church to shake hands with this new kind of politician. He is not the dignified statesman you have read about and admired afar off, who has every qualification for high office except the ability to get himself elected. This man knows the game of politics. He is not fastidious and likes nothing better than to be in the thick of a scrimmage. He has not the scholar's scorn of the aggregate mind. He thinks that it is a very good kind of mind if it is only rightly interpreted. He has the idea that what all of us want is better than what some few of us want, and that when all of us make up our minds to work together, we can get what we want without asking anybody's leave. He thinks that what all of us want is fair play, and so he goes straight for that without much regard for special interests. It is a simple program, but it's wonderful what a difference it makes. There never was a time, Scrooge, when the message of goodwill was so widely interpreted in action, or when it took hold of so many kinds of men. Perhaps you wouldn't mind my reading another little bit from St. Augustine. "Two are those to whom thou dost alms, two hunger, one for bread, the other for righteousness. Between these two famishing persons, thou, the doer of the good work, art set. The one craves what he may eat, the other craves what he may imitate. Thou feedest the one, give thyself as a pattern to the other. So hast thou given to both. The one thou hast caused to thank thee for satisfying his hunger. The other thou hast made to imitate thee by setting him a worthy example." It is this hunger for simple justice that is the great thing. And there are people who are giving their whole lives to satisfy it. What we need is to realize what it all means and to get that joyous thrill over it that came to you when you found for the first time that life consisted not in getting but in giving. It's a wonderful giving, this giving of oneself, and people do appreciate it. When you have ministered to a person's self-respect, when you have contributed to his self-reliance, when you have inspired him to self-help, you have given him something. And you are conscious of it, and so is he, though you both find it hard to express in the old terms. All the old Christmas cheer is in these reciprocities of friendship that have lost touch of condescension. We need some genial imagination to picture to all of the happiness that is being diffused by people who have come to look upon themselves not as God's almoners, but as sharers with others in the common good. I wish we had a new Dickens to write it up. "If you're waiting for that, you'll wait a long time," said Scrooge. Perhaps so, but the people are here all the same, and they're getting on with their work.
There was once in a faraway country where few people have ever traveled, one of the most wonderful churches that the world has ever seen, with huge stone columns and dark passages and a grand entrance leading to the main room of the church. In the farthest corner was the organ, and this organ was so loud that sometimes when it played, the people for miles around would close their shutters as if to prepare for a great thunderstorm. At one corner of the church was a great tower with ivy growing over it as far up as one could see. I say as far as one could see because the tower rose so far into the sky that it was only in very fair weather that anyone claimed to be able to see the top. Even then, one could not be certain that it was in sight. And as the men who built the church had been dead for hundreds of years, everyone had forgotten how high the tower was supposed to be. Now all the people knew that at the top of the tower was a wonderful chime of Christmas bells. They had hung there ever since the church had been built, and were the most beautiful sounding bells in all the world. Some people thought that this was because a great musician had cast them and arranged them in their place. Others said it was because of their great height, which reached way up where the air was purest and clearest. The strange thing about the chimes, though, was that no one had heard them ring for years and years. It was the custom on Christmas Eve for all the people in the kingdom to bring to the church their offerings to the Christ child. And when the greatest and best offering was laid on the altar, there used to come sounding above the music of the choir the glorious pealing of the Christmas chimes as they rang out far above in the tower. Some said that the wind rang them, while others believed that they were so high it was the angels who caused them to ring. But for many, many long years, the chimes had never been heard at all. Although no one knew exactly why this was so, it was said that the people had been growing less careful of their gifts for the Christ child, and that no offering was brought which was great enough to deserve the music of the chimes. Every Christmas Eve, the rich people still crowded to the altar, each one trying to bring some gift better than the others, without giving anything that he really wanted for himself. And the church was crowded with those who hoped that their offering would make the chimes ring. But though the service was splendid and the offering plentiful, only the roar of the wind could be heard far up the stone tower. The chimes remained silent. Now, a number of miles from the city, in a little country village where nothing could be seen of the great church but the top of the tower, there lived a boy named Pedro and his little brother. They knew very little about the Christmas chimes, but they'd heard of the wonderful service in the church on Christmas Eve. Pedro had a small piece of silver for which he had worked very hard, and this was to be his offering. While he was sorry he had to make such a small gift, since he had nothing else, he hoped that the Christ child would understand. The day before Christmas was bitterly cold, with an icy wind that sent the lonely snowflakes flying in the air and formed a hard white crust on the ground. Pedro and little brother were able to slip away quietly early in the afternoon, and by nightfall they had trudged so far, hand in hand, that they saw the lights of the big city just ahead of them. They were about to enter one of the great gates in the wall that surrounded it, when suddenly they saw something dark on the snow. It was a poor old woman who had fallen just outside the city, too sick and too tired to enter in where she might have found shelter. The soft white snow had made a sort of pillow for her, and she would soon be so sound asleep in the wintry air that no one could ever waken her again. All this Pedro saw in a moment as he knelt down beside her. He knew that he could not leave her, so he sadly told little brother to go on alone. But little brother didn't want to, because that would mean that Pedro would miss the Christmas festival. But Pedro, much as he wanted to go, knew that he couldn't leave the poor old woman whose face looked like the Madonna in the chapel window. Little brother still waited, hoping that Pedro would decide to go with him. But Pedro told him to hurry so that he would not miss the service. Then Pedro gave him the little piece of silver he had been saving and asked him to slip up to the altar when no one was looking and lay it down as his offering. And so Pedro hurried little brother off to the city, trying hard to keep back the tears as he heard the crunching footsteps sounding farther and farther away in the twilight. It was very hard remaining behind, helping the poor old woman in the snow, for it meant he had to miss the music and the splendor of the Christmas celebration that he'd been planning for so long. The great church was a most wonderful place that night. When the organ played and the thousands of people sang the glorious hymns, the walls shook with the sound, and little Pedro, far away in the cold snow outside the city walls, felt the earth tremble around him. After the beautiful service was over, the majestic procession with all the splendid offerings to be laid on the altar began. Rich men and beautiful ladies of the kingdom marched proudly up to the altar to lay down their gifts to the Christ child in the hope that their offering would make the chimes ring. A famous warrior strode forward in his suit of gleaming armor to deposit his offering, a great sword, all encrusted with the rarest jewels. All the people leaned forward excitedly in their seats, listening eagerly for the sound of the chimes. But the bells were silent. Behind him came a beautiful noblewoman, clad in a gown of blue and white silk, bearing a lovely picture painted by the kingdom's greatest artist. But still the chimes did not ring. Then followed the richest banker in the realm, bearing a huge golden casket so heavy that he could hardly carry it. With a confident smile on his face, he opened his treasure chest, revealing a vast quantity of glittering gold and jewels. But the chimes still did not ring. The procession moved on, and the altar was crowded with many and rare gifts of every kind from all the corners of the kingdom. Those who had brought offerings stood in a row behind the altar, silent and sullen in their great disappointment, for each one had fervently hoped his or her gift would bring forth the ringing of the chimes. Yet still the chimes remained strangely silent. All that the vast throng assembled in the church could hear was the cold, cold wind sighing through the great stone tower far above. On the faces of the assembled throng in the church, there were written expressions of disappointment and shattered hope, for all thought that surely, with such a magnificent collection of offerings, the glorious chimes would at last sound forth. But alas, they were as silent as could be. Then suddenly the hopes of the multitude arose. The king of the country himself marched down the aisle to present his gift to the Christ child. Even he, like all the others, hoped that he would win the ringing of the chimes. The king took off his crown, heavy with sparkling diamonds and rubies and other precious stones, and to the amazement of the assembled throng, he laid it gleaming on the altar as his offering for the Holy Child. As the king stood there with an expectant smile on his face, the multitude leaned forward eagerly, holding their breath in excitement and suspense. Surely the chimes will ring tonight, they said. Nothing like this has ever happened within the memory of man. And if they don't ring after this noble gift of the great king, why should they ever ring at all? But still the chimes were silent, and so the beautiful service was over. The assembled people were plainly disappointed as they sadly prepared to leave the church. Slowly they made their way outward. Then suddenly the organist stopped playing as though he were stricken. The people were stunned. All eyes strained toward the altar, where a small boy was kneeling in prayer. Yes, it was little brother, Pedro's little brother. He had just put something on the altar beside all the other magnificent gifts. It was a little piece of silver. Then, miracle of miracles, the chimes sounded forth. At last the glorious chimes were ringing. The people were so excited they could hardly believe it, for no one in the church had ever heard the chimes ring before. And then... there beside the altar stood an angel of the Lord, surrounded by the glowing rays of a golden halo. The angel raised her hand, as if to cast blessings upon little brother. Then she turned to the assembled multitude and spoke.
Tonight, after these many long years, your wonderful Christmas chimes have sounded again. There were many beautiful gifts to the Lord, but verily I say unto you, it is not jewels or other riches of this world that please the Christ child. What pleaseth him is love and unselfish sacrifice. Tonight the chimes have rung not because of the many wonderful gifts, but simply because of the love and unselfish sacrifice of a little boy.
Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget, if you want to listen to more of our audiobooks without breaking the bank, just visit us at CraftLit.com to see all of the books we've covered for free. This includes Emma by Jane Austen, Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Dracula by Bram Stoker, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, and other beloved classics. Many, many other beloved classics. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you there. If you enjoy what we do here on CraftLit, please don't forget to like and subscribe on iTunes. Give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button on YouTube. You can also support the show by subscribing to the CraftLit App Premium feed. You can check the link below for details. Your support helps keep CraftLit going strong, and we've got plenty of ways for you to get involved now. If you want more perks, you can head over to Patreon at patreon.com/CraftLit and become a patron of this art. You can also join our YouTube channel memberships for access to tons of premium books as bonuses, or you can support us at ko-fi.com/craftlit. And guess what? We've just relaunched our premium memberships over on craftlit.com. Go to craftlit.com/premium and check out all of the details there. Link is below as well. For a one-stop shop to all things CraftLit, please visit Linktree at linktr.ee/CraftLit channel. This is your go-to hub for all of our social media and more. They're all listed there for you. And I keep forgetting to mention, come join our Facebook group. It is full of the kindest, most creative makers and readers, and even some people who never really used to read. We've got them now. All right, that's it for now. Thank you. Take care of yourself. Have a great one. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.